don't typically start processing what she's saying until she quits talking. And then if I'm not immediately talking, it's like, why are you not interested in what I'm saying?
She needs you to stop and say, wow, is that what it feels like to be you?
How to win your spouse, right? We want to fight a winning battle, right? So that's kind of the perspective that we've got going into this. We're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7.
And these are a couple of the ones that you'll see used for couples a good bit. So we just wanted to dig into those and kind of break them down for you.
And going into this, it's kind of one way I look at this is when God gives specific instruction to one, for example, to wives or to husbands. That's something that you'd say that a husband or a wife needs to pay specific attention to, right? So God knows how He made us, and He knows what things we need to especially pay attention to. So He starts off here in verse 1, and He says, "Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may, without the word, be won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear."
So submission, being in subjection, that's kind of a hot topic, isn't it? And a lot of people don't understand it. And a lot of women are like, I'm not going to be a doormat. And ladies, I'm not a doormat. And when we talk about being in submission to the husband, we're not talking about being a doormat. If you really believe that God has gifted you to Him to be His helper and support system, you're going to be a support system. Because let's face it, if you're a doormat, you're kind of absent. You're not doing your role, right? And the biggest thing is, how do I do what I'm called to do right? But a lot of people are doing what they're called to do poorly, and it's causing them to not be heard. And you know, it's like if you're a pastor and you're standing up here and you're offending everyone in the congregation, you're probably not going to get the message across that God gave you, and that wouldn't be handling that message well, would it? But when we talk about that, basically, like we said earlier, it's kind of a, you know, if you clash on it, somebody gets to make that final call. But the thing is, submission and subjection is something willfully given. And so if submission is demanded, it can't be submission because there's no willfulness or willingness about that. And so the thing is, a woman can submit to a man who will seriously consider what she brings to the table. And so a lot of couples, the male and the female, are kind of tearing that down, and the devil knows that, right? He's kind of setting that up to make it to where they can't operate like they should.
And notice he says here that if any man or any husband doesn't obey the word. So how many women maybe think that your husband isn't being obedient to your words, right? So he's giving instruction. Right. And so this could be spiritually, maybe this is an unbeliever, right, but maybe he isn't listening to your words. What is the stance that he gives? What is the perspective, the positioning that he gives to a woman about what to do when her husband isn't responding to words?
Basically, God is showing us here that if he's not listening to your words, win him without words. But, you know, it's counterintuitive for a woman because we are motivated by words, right?
Men are typically visually motivated or visually stimulated, right? We know that men are moved by, whether it's a little child who watches bulldozers or he's laying there and he's watching the mobile, turn around over his head. Men are visually stimulated.
And so if a woman will realize God is showing us kind of a secret right here in the Word of how to win a man, and it's by respectful behavior. And so the thing is, one thing that we know, especially the more and more that we interact with couples, the more wordy a woman is, the more aggressive she is verbally and emotionally, the less likely her husband is going to hear her. And so we encourage women, reduce the emotion, think like a business meeting, right? Go slower, slow your voice down, lower it a little bit. Get rid of the intensity, because if you have a lot of emotion and a lot of intensity, the man is probably having to turn that down because it's kind of overload to the male brain. And so if a woman sees he's just not listening, you don't get more wordy, you win without words, right? because we all know men are visually stimulated by the body of a woman. God made him that way.
Right, so it's not a flaw in the manufacturing, right? That God planted that in men to move them, to motivate them, to notice the body, the movement, the motion of their wives.
And so if we are behaving in a respectful way from the male definition, not the female definition, then we're going to be noticed by our husband. And so God is showing us what to do to catch his attention here. And he goes on and he talks about whose adorning, let it not be with the outward adorning of plaiting of the hair, wearing of gold, putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God a great price. It's not that we don't fix our hair or wear jewelry or put on clothing, but instead it is that we have more focus on what we look like on the inside. And can you realize that if what comes out of you is flowing out of a meek and a quiet spirit, it's going to affect your behavior, your words, rather than something you put on. I'm going to try to act meek and quiet, but your spirit isn't meek and quiet. Your spirit's all in turmoil inside. It's going to show in the words, because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So it's going to affect our conversation if our spirit isn't like that.
The agitation, right? When a woman feels she isn't getting a need met, and she feels like maybe her husband isn't hearing her, right? And that's going to stir up an agitation there.
Can you imagine anything being of great price to God, who has everything, but he thinks it's quite valuable? And we would present to you that in the male eyes, it is also quite valuable to have a meek and quiet spirit. But you know what, ladies, if we don't feel heard, we have this way of getting louder and louder and more intense, when, you know what, if he's not going to hear, he's probably not going to hear even if we get louder and more intense.
So the concept here is meeting a need that's not your own, right? And it's coming and connecting with your spouse on what motivates them, not on what motivates you, right? So what is he going to say to men? He's going to say to men to use words, and we're going to get to that in Ephesians 5 in a little bit, right? So, but he's saying to women, don't use words. Don't use the thing that motivates you to try to motivate your spouse. Use the thing that motivates your spouse, right? So for a woman, words motivate her. Don't use so many words with him, and vice versa. So I'm not typically a real wordy person, but guess what? He's created a receptivity in her. She needs to hear my words. So what does he tell me? Use words.
And so the thing is, when you understand the difference in the male and female brain, she has a lot more processing than him going through the verbal and emotional centers, but he has more processing going through the motor and visual centers than she does. And so his brain is literally wired to hear and receive different inputs. And so there's a wisdom here in using the input that God designed to have the most effect. And so if what we're doing isn't working, why do we keep doing it? Let's do something different. But you know, a lot of times the men can be sitting there thinking, see, you're talking too much, you're too emotional, you're too intense. But the man feeds that, and actually, according to the research, actually kind of starts that in the marriage. So they've since the 70s, they've taken marriages from the getting married until divorce, or if they stay married. Successful marriages are defined as those that never divorce. Unsuccessful are defined as those that at some point over the decades did divorce. And so they can actually predict divorce with a 96% accuracy now. My guess is the 6% are those that are going to stay with it regardless. But there's just certain things that are so present in the failing marriage that when you see that, you know that the clock is ticking unless the couple turns that around. And so we would say to you men, realize your contribution. If you're seeing a very wordy, emotional, intense woman, look at what you're doing to contribute to that picture. You both are contributing.
So this is really interesting because, you know, we would be out walking, right? And Rhonda would say something in one lap. She'd be saying the same thing on the second lap. The third time around, you know, it's kind of like the lights go on. Okay, what do you need to hear from me right now? Right? Yeah. Because I learned that, you know, sometimes women get stuck, kind of like a concept of a broken record, right? And repeat themselves if they don't feel their husband hears or understands what they're presenting. And sometimes a woman doesn't notice it. A man can be thinking, my goodness, why are you repeating yourself? Okay, if that thought ever comes across your mind, why is she repeating herself? You need to find out why she's repeating herself. She's repeating herself because she doesn't think that you're hearing. You haven't said anything. But typically men process in silence, women process as they're speaking. So I don't typically start processing what she's saying until she quits talking. And then if I'm not immediately talking, it's like, why are you not interested in what I'm saying? And so
there's a couple of reasons women get stuck. So there's a part of their brain that's larger than that in the male brain, and they literally can get stuck in that emotion. And the husband, though, because that part of the brain is smaller, I forget which part, can actually help bring her out of that. But a lot of men don't bother to bring her out of that. They just get frustrated if she's stuck. But because the thing is, she doesn't feel heard. And so there can be connecting words like, okay, so it sounds to me like this is what you're saying. Is that right? Did I get it right?
Or if you need to think about it for a little bit, let her know that your silence means you're thinking about what she's saying, not that you're not interested.
And note there's also something called the Zeigernick Effect, which isn't in our notes, but I just want to say it real quick. And so basically, Mr. Zeigernick discovered this. Basically, what they found is when we have unfinished business, it stays in the back of the brain, kind of pestering us, right, till we get it done. It's the brain's way of reminding us, hey, there's something that you didn't finish, that you started and need to do. They have found that when there's unresolved conflict, guess what? It's the Zeigernick Effect kicks in. And it stays there reminding us we didn't finish that. And a lot of men, especially for the women, because of the way the wiring is connected all over the brain with memory and everything, men wonder, why does she get historical? Why does she remember everything I did 2 or 3 years ago? Probably because you didn't resolve it. And there's something that has continued all this time. It's a little string that connects all of those incidences that she's tried to share her heart. She's tried to say, this is a problem. Hey, would you look at me? Look what's happening in here. And instead you say, step aside, look at me, look what's going on in here. And she needs you to stop and say, wow, is that what it feels like to be you? Let me look a little closer. Tell me about that. I want to understand what it feels like to be you in the marriage.
For a long time, I thought Rhonda could not let go of some offense that I had in the past because she would bring up something that, well, you're doing the same thing now that you did, 5 years ago, and so men typically cannot, because I thought I would have to have a book that I'm writing down every infraction that you made to be able to remember that 5 years ago you did something, because men just forget it and we move on, right? But women, it's kind of like this spokes of a wheel or a spider web. It's kind of like they can reach into the past, bring it into the present, and find that relationship between what's going on now to what went on. Does anybody relate to that?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure that, okay, so what do you see? When we do a marriage life group and we start talking about concepts and stuff like that, and we hear people's, I didn't know that other men, wives were this way.
I thought my husband just had this problem.
I thought he was the only one, or I thought she was the only one. Guess what? You're married to someone that is likely just acting like the way God designed them.
Yes.
And understanding and appreciating and valuing what God gave you and working within the parameters of how He designed that they think and they act and they relate and they respond is a lot better than not understanding it and working against the flow.
Right, and that's what we hope that you all will get out of the various things we'll talk about today is how does my spouse, what do they contribute to, what do they bring to the table in this marriage? Have I been dismissing or discounting that? How can I begin to elevate that so there's a balance in this relationship? We get into more of that later, but...
All right, so it goes on in verse 5. He says, for after this manner in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are as long as you do well and are not afraid with any amazement. Okay, so he's given the idea here that the women are to put their trust in God and adorn themselves with that subjection to their husbands like Sarah. So what is it that most of the time we think about? Okay, what is this relationship between Sarah and Abraham? Because so we know that they went into another nation 2 times, and both times Abraham said, when we go there, I want you to tell them that you're my sister. All right, so how many of you women would like for your husband to introduce you as, this is my sister, right? So most women want to make sure that everybody knows the relationship, right?
Yep.
And so she probably wasn't on board with that. So, but yet what did she do? Did she, make a big uproar about it? No. So it's showing that she trusted in God. And so what we're seeing here is that even if a man is not, her husband is not doing something that you necessarily are on board with, God can still work it out for your good, not because you trust the husband, because your trust is in God.
Right.
You're not looking to your husband, you're looking to God.
And that's huge, because a lot of women won't let their husbands make a mistake. And it's like, well, do you think you don't make a mistake? A lot of times we look back and we're like, oh, I wish I'd done this or that different. Guess what? The husband makes mistakes. And in his role in the household, just like with our teenage and young adult children, if we can let them make some mistakes in the safety of the home, God can sometimes teach them a lot more through their mistake than if we shield and protect. Oh, no, we're not doing that. Now, obviously, we're not saying be in agreement if your husband says, hey, let's go rob the bank this afternoon, or something else that's immoral or unethical, right? We're not talking about that kind of stuff. We're talking about the everyday stuff of life. And sometimes it can be difficult for us women to let them mess up. And sometimes there's a pretty pathway and the gnarly looking pathway, and we're like, we're not walking that way. But you know what? You don't know where that pathway ends just because you're looking at how it begins. And so there were times in our marriage where I laid on the table, I don't think we should make this business decision, for example. And Sean made it anyway. But the thing is, God used it to position me and taught him valuable lessons, and we needed to walk the gnarly pathway. There was a reason for that.
So guess what? There was 2 very defining moments, right? That I made a decision to do something, and it did not turn out right, and Rhonda, wasn't on board with it. And guess what now? If she says, I don't have a good feeling about that, it's like, oh, really?
Tell me about that feeling.
Let's talk about that. I want to make sure that she's on board, because just like we talked about before, God didn't give you eyes in the back of your head. You don't see everything. Mm-hmm. And there's such a power in the agreement, right? And in the being together and appreciating and valuing the other perspective that you don't have.
And a lot of women will say, oh, my husband did this or that and didn't even tell me he was going to do it, didn't even talk to me about it. And it's like, well, I wonder why. He couldn't trust that he could talk to you without you guiding and directing that moment. Now, there's a lot of there's carnality and sin and pride in that picture too sometimes, right? So it's not just as simple as all that. But the thing is, when we do it God's way, God backs us up. I don't have to back me up. God's big enough to do that. But the thing is, too many times we women look at our husbands and say, well, nobody can change him. He's going to do this or that. And it's like, God's bigger than your husband. And if we can say, God, I trust you to make this work out for me, and I'm going to have peace in this situation. And if we walk this, what appears to be an unlovely pathway, and then on the other end, we look back and we say, I see now why we had to walk that pathway. Maybe we wish we didn't have to walk that pathway, but guess what? If there's something in the husband's heart or the family's heart that needs to be worked into or out of them, we may need to walk that pathway. And we don't always know why until later. But God knows, and He's faithful, and He's good to take even a big blunder and fix it for us and make it better.
And sometimes, we can learn a lot from our mistakes. And so it's still something that can be there to instruct us. Verse 7, he says, likewise, you husbands. Another thing is the idea of prayerfully considering what your wife is presenting. So this is something that a lot of times, say Rhonda presents something to me and I'm not maybe in agreement with that and I just immediately shoot it down, right? And then she doesn't feel like I really seriously or prayerfully considered what she was presenting, so she would be upset or maybe re-present it and keep presenting it, and then I feel like, well, you just want me to do it, your way. And so I finally give in. Okay, we'll do it your way. And then she doesn't want me to do it her way, right? All she wants is for me to seriously or prayerfully consider what she's presenting. And so this is really important, that if you aren't in agreement with something that she presents, you don't like the idea, right? You need to give it serious consideration.
And so that makes me feel heard if Sean says, I'll prayerfully consider that. And so the thing is, we would present to you men, be concerned if you're making a decision and you're not in union about it, because you're going forward in disunity, and that is not a godly thing. And so we would say, consider that if you don't agree, then you stop and pray about it. And if you can say to your wife, I really feel this is what God wants us to do. I'm so sorry it's not what you're feeling, but I just can't go that way in faith, because I really feel in my heart we're supposed to do this.
And a woman is typically going to go into panic mode if she feels like her husband is not receiving her influence. God called a woman to influence a man. Go back to the Genesis 2, right? It's not good that man should be alone. What was her relationship there? To influence him. If she feels like he isn't receiving influence, she isn't feeling like he's receiving what she was called to do. So she's going to go into panic mode.
And when Sean made the decisions that I didn't feel like were the best decisions in the past, I didn't say I told you so. I was in full support because it was our decision. I laid down my thoughts about it, and I'm like, well, this is the way we're going then. And we went forward in faith because that's what God had in mind for our family.
Man, the faith, the trust in God, regardless of the way things appear. So in verse 7, likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. This is the Greek word gnosis, science. Dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So, like we said, that knowledge is dwelling with her according to a science, a study. Study your wife.
And think back to that in Deuteronomy, where the man spent the first year learning how to cheer up and please his wife. Well, here, he's supposed to study her. And doesn't that just reek of the idea of the gift? And so when we look at the word, he should honor the instrument and that she's a joint heir. Basically, what that's saying there is she is a utensil, a tool, an instrument that God would use. That's what vessel means, I'm sorry. That God would use to work on him. And because of that, he should consider that of great value in his life. Oh my goodness, here is what God gave me so that he could work on me directly. This woman right here. And he should highly value her because he understands God's word. And the thing is, we know people can do it the way the world does it, but the percentages just aren't there to support long-term marriage, right? But we would present to you, God shows us stuff in his word to make the marriage go smoothly when we learn how to work his word. And we would challenge you, study these scriptures, see what the Lord would show you, and then make a commitment to God. I'm going to be obedient to your word. My flesh doesn't have to love it, but I'm going to choose to obey God.
Most people would agree that women are more complex, right, to understand than men. Men are pretty predictable, our levels, kind of stay like this, and women are kind of designed like this, and so you think about the study, a lot of men might wish their wife came with a manual when they got married, but most women probably feel like, I could kind of figure him out pretty quick, so it does take some study and understanding there. And so also mentioning that he specifically said as being heirs together. Okay, men are typically think more individualistically. Women typically think in a more of a relational or we sense. So guess what? What is he telling men? Act like think like you're heirs together. Think in a together. He has to tell men. We have to be told. Think in a we connected sense. There's so many times, when Rhonda would share something, I would think, okay, think, connect, because that's what women are looking for when you are speaking or when they're interacting. They're looking for a connection. All right, so let's move on to Ephesians Chapter 5 and verses 22 through 33. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he's the Savior of the body. And so what we see here is that he's saying the husband is to do something even as Christ. In other words, the husband is representing Jesus Christ, and his role, like Jesus Christ relates to the church, he's saying the husband relates to the wife in the same way. So like Christ is the head of the church, or he is the Savior of the body, the husband is like that knight in shining armor to his wife. In other words, you can save her from some things.
And the thing is, when a man is acting like this and he will lay down his life for his wife, and that's not just a physical concept, right? That's on other levels. Then a woman can easily submit to that. You see how they work together? And so, when a man, however, isn't going to consider her, doesn't respect her as a gift from God put in the relationship, then he kind of sets a stumbling block before her and tempts her to act in a carnal and worldly way. Now, that doesn't give us license to act in a carnal and worldly way. We still, as ladies, regardless of if we're tempted, are supposed to choose to be obedient and do it God's way, right? Because God will have to deal with the husband if he discounts what you say, And one thing we would present, one of the things that causes problems in a marriage is what we choose to do when it doesn't go our way. And this goes for the husband and the wife. If my spouse does something I don't care for, how will I respond? And is that okay? Am I showing God? Am I letting Holy Spirit manifest? Is my spouse partaking of the fruits of the Spirit at that moment? Or do I become a prickly porcupine and I jab everybody all around me? Everybody's unhappy because I'm unhappy and I'm going to make everybody else miserable. Or the thing that I would present, as you go through the decades, we're in our 50s, you go through these little roller coaster rides, right? And you go through things, but you come out on the other side. And the thing is, you can go through things with a good attitude or a bad attitude, but you're still going to go through it. And so we would challenge you, if you go through it with a good attitude, you come out better on the other side. You come out healthier on the other side, and so does your family.
All right, let's look at verse 24. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. So healthy marriages share power. Look at the idea here that he's showing. How does the church subject unto Christ? Is Christ demanding it? Or is it rather that he is creating the environment where the church wants to submit to Christ, and because they see how he gives himself for them, they want to respond to that. So the submission is not a demanded submission. The submission is a choice, a willingly given.
Yeah, you don't see God going around saying, "You're such a horrible believer. I don't like you. You don't even belong in the family." I mean, does God do that? Right? He doesn't. He accepts us like we are, and that's what we're saying in the Christ church relationship that is the model for the marriage, is loving our spouse, going back to what we said earlier, unconditionally like they are, not trying to change them, because the fact is that's who you chose to do life with, and here you are, whatever it is, right? And the fact is, if we looked at your spouse, they might not think you're perfect either. They might feel challenged with you. And so if we can just say, you know what, I think we both contribute to the good times and the rough times in this relationship, and we both need to take responsibility and choose to find union with who we are and where we are.
And so he says that husbands, in the next verse, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. So here you see the idea of sacrificial love. And husbands typically are wired that way, where we think in a sacrificial way of giving ourselves, like men giving themselves for their country, or a man thinking of giving himself for his wife. And it is easy for a woman to submit to a man who she sees is giving himself for her. So then he says that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it, and this is Christ, that he might present it to himself, a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. And look what he's saying to a man, that basically you can present to yourself as Christ presents the church. How does Christ present the church to himself? As a glorious church without spot or wrinkle, with his word, with the washing of water by the word. How does a husband present his wife to himself without spot or wrinkle, with his words? See what he's saying, what we talked about earlier, where he says a woman, don't use words, right, to motivate your husband. Now he's saying, men, use your words, because that's what motivates the woman. God has created a receptivity in the woman for words, right? She wants to hear words. She's motivated by words. Now she says, man, use your words. And this is something I realized early on in our marriage, that I could make Rhonda whatever kind of wife that I wanted her to be by the words that I spoke, right? So men, what are you speaking over your wife? What are you saying over your wife? And that you can present her to yourself. If you don't have what you want, men, in your wife, what are you saying?
And, like what he was saying, that's one thing that I think my mother taught me early on is we as women can build up or tear down our husbands. And so we can kind of choose what we're going to do and the stance that we're going to take. Because the thing is, we really should be treating our husbands according to what we're believing God for. And so, I don't have to treat him based on any faults or anything like that. I'm exercising my faith. I see things. I don't just see us where we were or where we are. I also see where we're growing in God. But, the things that stand out to me when I look at this verse is the sanctify, cleanse, wash, present to himself glorious, without spot, without blemish. And he's telling the husband and wife, he's talking about the husband and wife relationship. And we would present, men, are you presenting your wife to yourself as glorious? What are you getting back? Because if you're not getting back something glorious, there's spots and there's blemishes and there's soil going on in the picture. Are you bathing her with words? Because one thing we hear with women in sessions, their husbands generally are not verbal enough with them. They're starving in the relationship for words, for emotion, for connection, and the husband is not giving it to them. And they're going wild. It's like your beloved pet. You feed them, right? But if you didn't feed them, they might act a little weird, right? And then you could say, what's wrong with that dog,
So let me ask this. How many of you men ask your wives, do you love me? What are you thinking about me? And let's flip it around. How many of you men hear your wives say, what do you think about me? Tell me that you love me and things like that, right? It's the woman that's asking for words. I want you to speak words. Let me hear what you think. What is the church doing, right? Jesus Christ is not asking, church, what do you think about? Sometimes, right? He asks, Peter, who did men say that I am? But for the most part, it's not, Christ asking the church to define him. It's the church saying, God, define me. Show me who I am. Give me my identity, just like the woman is with the man.
They actually show in the research that the woman is the one that tends to find the dirt in the relationship because she's uncomfortable, right? She makes herself at home in the heart of the relationship. Yeah, the man is a little more focused in the work and the things outside the home. And so if there's uncleanness within the heart level there, she's going to detect it before he will. And so, when you look at blemishes and you look at spots and stuff like that, we would present for your consideration that this is unresolved conflict. These are issues. These are things that she needs to work through. Wow. And the thing is, if the man doesn't connect with her on these things and help work through some of these things, they stay there. And then he's wondering, why does she have that spot? Why does she have that blemish? because he's not bathing her with words. And sometimes a man just goes quiet, and we teach the men, verbalize, hey, I'm thinking about that. But the thing is, a lot of women don't want to coach their husbands, but men need to be coached when it comes to verbal and emotional interactions. They don't get it. And we see this consistently with the couples we deal with, unless we've got a man that's the more verbal one.
For the most part, men don't get relationship, all right? It's not that we can't understand it at all, but it's like women get relationship. For the most part, men, we need to be instructed to understand relationship.
And it's okay to say something like, what I'd really like to hear from you right now is, or something like that, women, because that's a way of coaching. Now, he doesn't have to give it to us, right? And that's okay. It's his choice. He's not my child. He's not my puppet. I'm not a dictator. But the thing is, I can let him know, hey, I need this right now. Could we take a minute for this? And then either he wants to or doesn't want to, and that's all right.
So the idea there is not thinking that, well, he isn't giving it to me and he knows I need it, or he remembers that I need it. The idea is he needs instruction. He needs to know what you need. So treat it more like you're giving him instruction, or that 101 class.
And we say it's all right. We make a choice, a decision, but we know it's really not all right. The fact is, when we disconnect like this, we create walls and distance in the relationship. We can say it's all right because I decide I am not going to make war over it. However, it will create walls. It will create distance. And everybody has to readjust to be okay with the new distance when we decide, I'm not going to connect with her verbally. And it's like, well, then you're choosing something in the marriage. Do you know about 70% of divorces now are initiated by women? And we see that so much with the couples that we deal with. The women are it's like they're almost going crazy emotionally, because they're so deprived, they're so neglected in the relationship. Now, there's definitely neglects at the men, and we'll get into all of the needs and stuff in the third session, but the thing that we present is, it goes both ways, right?
Wow.
There's so much to say on this.
So ought men, in verse 28, so ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. What we want to see here is to treat your spouse's perspective, treat the other one's viewpoint just like it was your own. It's loving your wife like it's your own body. Loving that thought that she has that's different than mine as if that was my own thought.
And that's what we want in the relationship. We want to feel honored in the marriage, right? We want to feel that our perspective is valued, and that's not just the woman, it's also the man. Because we hear so many men, they feel like the woman is so emotional and so verbal, she's the only one that gets to share the issues in the relationship, and she never takes the time to listen to his. That's a complicated picture, but the fact is, whenever someone bothers to initiate to talk to us about something in the marriage, if we can keep it brief, and if we can let the speaker remain the speaker and the listener remain the listener, and make sure we're getting that heart message by confirming, this is what I think you're saying. Let me pray about that and see what the Lord shows me to adjust. Unless you can talk about it, and that'd be amazing, and then you could come up with a plan together, which should be a goal.
For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, even as the Lord the church. What we want to see here is that the role of the husband is that of nourishing and cherishing. What does nourishing make you think of, right? If you got a plant or something, you know that plant needs to be fed. And what if the leaves are wilting? The leaves are maybe spotted, or maybe an insect is eating off that leaf. Do you get out there and you fuss at your plant? Why are your leaves wilting? Why don't you straighten up? Why can't you grow like the other plants? Or is it the husbandman's role? That's what the Bible calls, right? Somebody takes care of plants is a husbandman who's taking care of the plant, and it's my role, if her leaves are wilting or there's something going on there, I don't fuss at her because I don't like what I'm seeing. It's my role as the husbandman to give her, to nourish and cherish her and give her the nutrients she needs to thrive and to grow.
And so all the points that we present are not so that to bring imbalance to one side or the other, but to show the responsibility that's needed in the marriage to keep it stable and balanced, and to help maybe you see if you're detecting and sensitive inside, Lord, what are you showing me that we need to work on in our marriage to make it stable, to make it grow, to make it healthy?
We each have our lane, right, that we have to stay in. And if we understand the roles and the design that God has, we want to stay within that realm. All right, so he says, for we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. And so, of course, he's giving there the relationship again between Christ and the church is the same as that between a husband and wife.
You know, one thing we would present to you is a temptation when needs are not being met. It can happen if you're not aware that those needs can rise to the level that they take predominance over everything and can become an idol. And then we demand that both spouses in the relationship submit to that need. You should be meeting my need. All we can see is the lack and the deficit. This is a marriage spinning out of control when it gets to this point. But the fact is, when that happens, and we're worshiping the need, basically, at the expense of the spouse, at the expense of the relationship. Now the need is much more important than me, than him, than the relationship, than the family, than the children. And then I'm demanding, keep my commandments, or I will make judgments on you, and you will have punishments. It's kind of like we set up our own laws when the spouse goes against us by not meeting our needs. And so, you know, we would present, there's going to be times when needs aren't met. And depending on where you are in the relationship, you probably have needs that aren't met. And if you can just give those as a sacrifice to the Lord and say, Lord, you meet my needs. Because the fact is, if your marriage fell apart, your spouse wouldn't be meeting those needs, right? And so you would be turning to the Lord to meet those needs. And so for peace in the relationship, that you would be a peacemaker in your marriage, you don't want to ever let a need be escalated to the point that it means more to you than anything else in the relationship.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. He says, though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So what we see here is that he's telling us what to do when we have negative thoughts, right? You're going to have negative thoughts, and he's telling you what to do. He's saying to cast down the imaginations and the high things that are exalting themselves against the knowledge of God or of good.
I love this scripture because it tells us what to do with the negative thoughts we might have about our spouse, that we're supposed to take them captive and bring them into obedience. So when we know what God's word says about marriage and what God's word says that I as a wife should be, or Sean as a husband should be, then when there's things that the enemy wants to bring in that doesn't line up, say I'm tempted to respond in kind, you know, you sounded a little sharp to me, so you deserve for me to be sharp back, right? And it's like that's a temptation to be disobedient to what God shows in the word. And so what we do is we realize that the enemy likes to have a stronghold in the heart where he can shoot at us from the inside with our very own thoughts. And so those imaginations, he tells us what the strongholds are. They're thought processes, they're imaginations that are set up in the heart, and we need to take them captive. First of all, we have to recognize they're even the enemy, because we may believe it's okay for me to think this way. It's okay for me to feel this way. It's okay for me to allow this in my heart. And the thing is, if it's not God, it doesn't need to be in my heart, because what's in the abundance of the heart is going to spill out of the mouth, right? And so we can take those thoughts captive and we can make them be obedient. So if we know the Word of God, we conform our mind to the mind of Christ, and we transform our thinking to line up with His thinking.
You know, there's some things that we can understand about the pathways, right, that we have in our brain. When we do something habitually over and over and over, it becomes a place that we travel and we go to very quickly, right? And so we can have negative pathways, the way we typically have been thinking about our spouse, if it's in a negative way, and we go there very quickly. They do something, it doesn't sit right with us, and we think, oh, bam. we think that negative thought. We can change that. We can change and go maybe those other pathways in our brain that are to thinking good about them. We don't travel that way very often. And it's very difficult, right? If you ever go through the woods and it's grown up and you have to, take a machete and beat your way through, right? That's a hard pathway. That's not a super highway. Maybe in your brain, it's like a super highway to go to the bad thought and you go there really fast. I can go from point A to point B. But the good thought is like going through the woods, through the stickers. But you can transform those areas in your brain, right? And we can change and make it and reverse it so that I very quickly go to, I think, the good thought by traveling there more often.
They actually have shown that with every thought that you have, your brain lays down a protein. And as you continue to lay down the proteins, you create pathways. And the more you use them, the more you develop them. You can actually cause bad pathways to deteriorate because of not using them.
So in Revelation, we're familiar with where he said to the church about returning to your first love. And so what we want to present to you now is what we call caring days. And this is an exercise where we do little things for our spouse. So what we want to encourage you to do is to make a list of 15 to 18 things that are caring items, caring words, caring actions, little things that your spouse could do for you, and exchange lists and pick 5 of those to do for each other each day.
This can really turn a marriage around, especially if you're struggling, because couples quit doing the little things. They were doing them when they dated, and then they quit doing the little things. And when we start doing these things and we'll notice the lists are different, male, female, when we start doing these little things for each other, it makes the other person that made the list feel cared for, feel noticed, feel important again. And we will see over just a couple of weeks that start changing hearts in the relationship. And so it helps you learn how your spouse is thinking and what they need. You need to be able to update these things, but they're little things like look me in the eyes when we're talking.
Send me a text that you were thinking about me.
At the end of the day, ask me how my day went.
Hold my hand.
Let me sit in your lap.
Okay. And the list goes on.
Yeah.
So these are little things. It's not dinner and a movie, and it's nothing that's related to conflict, okay? So it's not going to be anything that's related to a conflict topic.
And we might have to periodically update our list to keep it current. And so you would do 5 of those every day if you do. We say that you're going to do this because we're used to telling couples that all the time. And so if you would choose to do this, you would do 5 a day, any 5. It could be the same 5, and you want to show appreciation for the effort your spouse is making. You don't want to get on to them and scold them because they didn't do it or didn't do enough or you didn't like the way they did it.
This is really interesting because you start seeing that you can begin speaking the language of care to your spouse.
Right.
It's their language, right? I need to speak her language, not mine. I don't need to be doing for her the things that speak caring for me. And vice versa. She needs to know what speaks caring to me. All right, so Romans 14, the idea that we want to see there, that it's okay for you to see things differently. We've kind of touched on that some. And so, but we, basically in that chapter there, he's saying, hey, you got one person that sees every day is alike. One person sees one day is better than the other. You got one person that says it's okay to eat meat. The other person says, no, it's not okay to eat meat. But God has received him, he says, right? So what he's showing there is that we ought to receive the other person who has a different perspective than our own. And this is what we want to exercise in our marriage, is allowing for difference.
A lot of people have trouble with the submission. That's something that you see over, especially I think this past several decades. A lot of men grew up in homes where the man was the dominant person and the wife was like a servant or a child in the relationship. And there was a lot of rebellion and kickback from that. And, if you do things like that with your teenage and young adult children, guess what? You see the same thing. It doesn't make for a healthy relationship. And it definitely doesn't honor that, your partners in the marriage. One wasn't created as a servant.
We're in this together.
Yeah.
It's the we approach. A lot of times men can come across in a negative way just because, okay, physiologically,
Right.
We're wired, we have a deeper voice and maybe have a more commanding way that we come across.
And a woman
okay?
is used to naturally kind of
Right,
giving into the
right.
male.
So,
Yeah.
she might shrink back from, maybe I might say something to Rhonda, right? And I see maybe in a look in her face, or maybe she responds in a certain way, and I can tell, that didn't go over well, and she said, well, you came across in a harsh way. I can come across in a harsh way
And
without
don't need
necessarily
to.
even trying, but I have to train myself to know how to speak in a receptive way to the person I want to hear what I'm speaking.
Because it's not about my intentions. It's
Mm-hmm.
more about the impact, the way it felt to be the spouse in that moment.
Right.
And if we can never hear that, and we can never allow our spouse to say to us, wow, that felt negative to me. Could you try that again? But if we're like, I didn't mean that, well, that's the way I am, then basically we're kind of dooming the relationship to stay where it won't probably stay like it is. It'll probably spiral in a negative direction. Because the thing is, if there's any reason that we give license to ourselves to treat our spouse in a way that the spouse defines as not okay with me, we're creating distance, we're creating walls, because we shush each other when we do
So
that.
many times that's what I would go to. If she presented something, it's like, well, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean it. You shouldn't have taken it that way because I didn't mean that. And it's like, it doesn't matter what I meant. It matters how it came across to the listener. And so I need to make the change to be able to communicate. Just like if you went into another country that speaks another language, you have to communicate within the culture and the understanding of where you are if you want to get something done. Did that stir up any questions yet, or comments or anything? Wheels turning?
I would say in our marriage relationship, that was something that we learned early on. Kind of what y'all are talking about right now is just not necessarily the intention, but we've both really adopted this procedure that I guess we call it a procedure that we do. If someone gets hurt or they're offended, they say, well, what you said made me feel. And just communicating what you feel for the other person to kind of breaks that barrier of the aha moment of, okay, I made you feel that way, that I'm sorry. That's the first step, just apologizing, and then being able to kind of bridge the gap from there.
When I say something, my intention goes through the filter of the way I say things, my facial expressions, tone of voice, choice of words, and body language, and then it goes through the filter of Sean's family of origin experience, past relationship experiences, the way Sean thinks and interprets things, and then it is impact. We should care whether intent equals impact. It's a poor communicator that does not care whether they got their message across or not. We should even ask, what did you hear me say? What does it sound like to you?
Or even to get into the practice of repeating back. So what you're saying is, so your spouse says something, so what you're saying is,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, very quickly, you can hear your spouse comes back, oh, so what you're saying is, in a real jabbing way.
Right.
It's like, no, that's not what I'm communicating. Right.
Yeah, because a lot of time, and this is something we dealt with. So say I would present an issue, and we went through this for a couple of decades. I would present an issue, being the female, the one that brings up issues more, and then right away, Sean would reply on the topic of the headline of the issue, but he would miss what I was saying.
Yeah, more like, she would say, I don't want you to do such and such. And it's like, well, I wouldn't do such and such if you didn't do, this. And then, so basically what I did is I flipped it, right? I flipped it from her topic over to now it's my issue. And it's like, if you hadn't have, touched on my issue, I wouldn't have done that. So that we call that topic A, topic B.
Yeah, and so that'll hinder a lot of discussions, and you may find that's what's happening with you. Now, usually the couples, especially the men, don't realize or admit that that's what happened. And so basically what I did that brought peace was we would discuss Sean's issue first. because he couldn't hear mine back then.
Even if she brought
Right.
hers up first.
Because he couldn't hear mine until his was addressed. And so we would talk about it, and then after we talked about that for a while, and I said, well, can we talk about what I was bringing up?
Do you feel like your issue
It's
is
like, we did
resolved?
talk about it. We just talked about it for 3 hours, and it's like, no, we didn't talk about it. We talked about
I
what
talked
you
about
wanted to
my
talk about.
version of her issue.
Well, anyway, we came up with a good pattern. No, we don't always stick to it. It slips up on us sometimes, right? But the big thing to remember is if you can make a time to talk about something, if you can keep it awfully brief, if somebody is monologuing or going into grand soliloquies, you're probably abusing the moment. And so especially for a man, you lose the man. If you're talking too many sentences at once, ladies, you probably lost him. He has no clue.
He doesn't even know what the topic is after so
His
many
mind
minutes.
is just like, whoa, And so if you can reduce that, we encourage couples, reduce that to 1 to 3 sentences and make it in the form of a positive request if you can. And then gently bounce with tidbits, like little pieces of cat food or dog food, back and forth on that before you would present any additional information. But a lot of women, and probably men too, but I think we women do it more, like to drag their husbands through the dirt. You know how in the cowboy movies they would tie the cowboy to the back of the horse and drag him across the fields? Women do that sometimes because if their spouse hurt them, I need you to know what it felt like to be me. I felt like this and I felt like that.
Because she wants him to connect with her.
Right. But that's not necessary to get a change.
But it's honestly very valuable because when Rhonda feels like I'm hurt with what hurts her, right? Then she knows that I feel the impact of what happened. But if I insulate myself from it because I don't want to be hurt, so I don't want what hurt her to hurt me, right? But think of the power of the gospel is that Jesus Christ became flesh to be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. And he said that's what made him a great faithful high priest on our behalf. So that is the core of our redemption is tied to Jesus Christ becoming in flesh and changing us by that.
He left heaven to walk like we walk. And isn't that a great example for the couple to walk in the other person's shoes, to understand what does it feel like to be married to me anyway? Because if we don't care about the answer to that question, probably not going to come to a healthy place or go to an intimate place, depending on where you are in the relationship. Did that stir any other thoughts?
Winding down, we got a couple of minutes.
Yeah. I'll present one more thing then. One thing that is very helpful, I think, for couples that are struggling. Usually the relationship is somewhere on the spectrum of acquaintance, casual friend, good friend, best friend, lovers, married and stable, married and positive, great or intimate, right? You got that whole spectrum. So we encourage couples that are struggling, place yourself on that spectrum. And of course, when they come to us, a lot of times they're at acquaintance level, right? They're talking divorce. And so it's like, okay, if you consider that your relationship is at acquaintance level, what would you do to get this man or this woman, if that's the case, to want to go out with you, to want to spend time with you, to want to get to know you? Would you tell them everything they need to change, everything you don't like about them? No, I wouldn't do that. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, I probably wouldn't make friends if I did that. And it's like, well, right now you two are not friends. And so if you want to build the relationship and you go to the beginning and work from there, then you would say, how do we get this from casual acquaintance to casual friendship? If we're in the casual friendship, how do we get it from there to best friendship? And the thing is, what would you divulge? What would you talk about in those various levels of relationship? A lot of women will tell me, well, in a healthy marriage, I ought to be able to talk about this and that. And it's like, but your marriage isn't healthy. And so if it's not healthy,
you can't pretend that you're somewhere that you're not
No.
and live by the rules of what you wish you were. You need to be living by the rules of where you
it has
really
a
are.
damaging effect, actually, to behave like that when the couple actually is in ICU. You know what? It's like he's saying he's going to divorce you if there's not a change here. So
he ought to be able
Yeah.
to eat steak and potato, right? But no, he's on a feeding tube.
And it's like, so if we go and we try to meet all of your needs right now, he's out the door, right? So we need to focus on him. But we look at all those levels, right? And how can we grow the relationship? Or you can start from where you are and work backwards. So that was starting from the beginning, working forward to repair, to regrow. But we can also start with where we are and work backwards. And that's the peeling back of the layers of the onion, so to speak, where we talk about this issue. And guess what? When we resolve it, it exposes something we hadn't dealt with in a while. And we deal with that one and peel it off, and it exposes something even deeper in the heart as we learn to go deeper and deeper in each other's hearts.